Yes.
I think we should start. I think you should start by saying it's go time.
We have started.
Go time.
We did.
Oh shit, we started.
This is sort of in
Thanks for telling us we're live, Matt.
Well, this is in honor of Software Defined Talk because I think that's
I wanted to do my hair first.
How they start their episode.
Me too.
So, okay, we're going to go ahead. Trevor and I will say our little beginning introduction thing, and then we'll go into this nonsense. So, it's time for Arrested DevOps, the podcast where we help you achieve understanding, develop good practices, and operate your team and organization for maximum DevOps awesomeness. I'm Matty Stratton, and joining me is...
For once in a while, it's Trevor Hess.
Yep, and we're also joined by our largest panel ever. Our Windows Redux episode had 5 guests. We got at least 7, and if I know 8. We have 8, and 8 is more than 5. But first we have
8 is enough. It's enough.
8 is enough. It is more than enough. First, we'll have a word from our sponsors. By the way, so a little behind the scenes on this. The reason that we do pre-roll.
Isn't this the behind the scenes episode?
It is. That's why I'm saying it. We do pre-roll of our sponsors, mostly because the one time throughout an entire episode that Trevor stumbles over words is when he's reading sponsor copy. So
it's usually because Matt changes it at the last minute and doesn't tell me.
Yeah. So
you guys have sponsors? That's so cool.
It's really weird. People give you money to talk to other people so that they get their name in front of other people.
They do. We are joined. We've got hosts from podcasts, including Go Time, Community Pulse, Good Old Ship Show, and Food Fight. So welcome to Podcast Behind the Music. The show notes for this episode can be found eventually at arresteddevops.com/behindthemusic. If you're watching us live right now, don't go there because there's nothing.
You want to read back those podcasts one more time, Matt? Because it sounded like you said one big podcast name.
Well, tonight it's the Go Pulse Ship the Food.
Go Pulse Ship the Food?
What were you saying about stumbling over words, Matt?
Yeah. Okay. So we're joined by hosts from podcasts, including Go Time, Community Pulse, The Ship Show, and Food Fight.
I feel like maybe.
By the way, and your show, Nathan and Nell, it is correctly referred to as Food Fight, right? It's not the Food Fight Show. It is Food Fight.
We'll answer to either, but Food Fight works for me.
Okay. So I
always call it the Food Fight Show. So whatever, the Food Fight Show.
It's like the Facebook. Eventually, it'll lose the.
If you have David Grohl on, will it be the Food Fight Show?
It will be the Food Fight.
Let's edit that. Edit that right out. Edit that right out. That was neither pod nor cast. Get rid of it.
That was it. So I think what we did some introductions to ourselves during the pre-recording time, but let's maybe introduce ourselves to the audience. We start with just maybe talking a little bit about the show. So if you could introduce your show, tell us a little bit about it, why you started, and of course how people can find you. So we'll start with our friends from Go Time.
So we have a show called Go Time FM, and that's myself, Brian Kettleson, and Carlicia Pinto there. They wave.
We wave on the podcast.
I know, right?
That really translates well to radio. I've got a face for radio.
I tell people that all the time. So our show is about the Go programming language and kind of the community and things surrounding that. But because of the usages of Go, we end up talking about like containers and container orchestration and cloud stuff a little bit too.
A lot.
And you can find that at gotime.fm.
And y'all are the only show that has full representation here. Everybody else is. I guess Food Fight might just be them, so we'll find out. But speaking of which, Food Fight, Nathan and Nell, you want to tell us about your show and where people can find you?
Absolutely. Nathan, you started the Food Fight show, so why don't you start us off?
Not it. I didn't start the Food Fight show. I muscled my way onto the Food Fight show. So why don't you tell them about it?
You bet. Well, Food Fight, as it exists now, I've been on it, I think, 2 or 3 years now. I can't remember. But we started out as a chef podcast, focused mainly on chef software, habitat, everything in between. And it's really evolved into, we still talk about chef plenty, but we talk a lot about general DevOps. We interview the personalities from DevOps and just have a wonderful time.
Yeah, we like to call it the show where DevOps chefs come to battle.
Absolutely.
How much food actually gets made, though?
Nathan, how long have you worked for Chef?
Nailed it.
Yeah.
We eat a lot of corned beef hash, but
We do indeed.
not on the show.
But here's the thing. There's your next idea, right? Is you get all of the guests, the previous guests from the show on board, and you do a cooking competition.
And you
Or you literally have them throw food at each other.
Yeah,
That too?
We could do
They could share recipes.
We do have we do have an unreleased episode that maybe we can talk about later that might just have to do with corned beef hash.
Oh.
This is true.
There's nothing
Is
wrong
it the
with
corned beef bash?
that. Boom!
Oh.
That makes up
Oh,
for your-
that was a spoiler.
That makes up for your past digressions, Trevor. With the whole Foo Fighters thing.
So, Mary, would you like to tell us about Community Pulse and what
Sure.
your show is about?
Absolutely. So PJ, who's
That's
on here
me.
with us today, and Jason Hand and myself, we run Community Pulse. And it's kind of DevOps related because all three of us have somewhat of a background in DevOps and DevOps related things. But we focus more on the community aspect. So developer relations, developer evangelism, developer advocates, community people, all of those types of things. We interview a variety of folks throughout those professions and talk about all types of topics that are relevant to those of us who are doing community work and community building full time. You can find us online, communitypulse.io, on Twitter, community_pulse, and we are on, I believe, pretty much every podcasting software. So any app that you want to find us on, feel free.
Including if you have the podcasting app enabled for your Alexa, you can say, "Hey Alexa, play the Community Pulse," and it will do it. And it's the
Still my
freakiest
favorite thing.
It's
Oh.
so weird.
We were like somehow through some weird syndication available in Roku like 3 years ago, and it was the weirdest
Nice.
thing. I'm like, who's listening to podcasts on the Roku? I don't know. I did, but only to listen to myself. Paul, you want to represent the ship show here, please?
The ship show. Yeah, we were making a joke that I'm the
Isn't it the
podcaster.
shipwreck show at this point?
The what?
Boom.
Oh,
The
Roasted.
The ship what?
the shipwreck show.
Ooh, that's
Shots fired.
all right. I'm done.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, our podcast tagline was build engineering, DevOps, release management, and everything in between. I'm looking at this right now. We podcasted. We stopped podcasting on in March in 2016, and there's a funny story that maybe we'll get to about that. But we were one of the earlier podcasts, like maybe depends on how you define DevOps podcast, but there's DevOps Cafe and the Food Fight show, and I think we're number 3. We had talked about DevOps, and we had a lot of different perspectives. There were some really good arguments because my background at the time was heavy in release engineering, so we got to argue about. I think the first episode is DevOps just release engineering, which I will say yes, it still is. So yes, and you can reach us on theshipshow.com if you want to see old episodes, and you can't get them on any of the podcasting software because we haven't published one forever. And I'm not going to tell you the Twitter name because just don't follow it. Follow me. Follow me on Twitter instead of the Ship Show.
Both Food Fight and Ship Show were very influential in the rest of DevOps because they're influential for me. But there was, so on Sprout Social, which we used for our tweeting and Facebooking for a while, you can punch in like how you rank and compare socially to your competitors. And so I would stack rank and try to figure out how we compared socially to Ship Show and Food Fight on Twitter. And I'm pleased to say that we were pretty much, crushing Food Fight all the time, but it was hard to keep up with Ship Show. There was a lot more engagement on Ship Show. So
well, and the ship show was a horrible name, and we can talk about why later. But yeah, there's a story behind that too. But yes.
So yeah, I think what would be a great question to kind of get started is those of us who have guests on our show, which I think is everybody. Now that I look at it, I had said if because I thought we were going to have software defined talk on the show. So since we all have guests and stuff, how do you figure out who's going to be on your show? And we'll leave this kind of open to anybody who wants to jump in to talk about guests.
I'd like to say from the community pulse side, our issue is often more who not to have on the show, because with three advocates that are out there in the community all the time, like we talk to people and like everyone you talk to is like, oh, I just met Maddie Stratton and I totally want him on the show. Oh, cool, but we got this person lined up. Nathan's coming over here and we're gonna have Nell and like everybody, and like so we actually have this like ridiculously long list of guests that we want and this ridiculously short amount of time that we can actually do shows. And bless you all for having this many people on a panel. I don't think we could ever do this on Community Pulse. No. Mary would flip out. She'd be like, that's a lot for me. That's a lot of bullet points.
It'd be too many. But
yeah, I mean, like finding guests is easy as long as you have, like, now that we have kind of our content organized and Mary's very, very, like, she's the savior of the show for this, but saying like, hey, maybe we should have like, a plan. And we're like, cool. Now that we have a plan, we have like this kind of regimented thing that we're doing, we can actually say, okay, these are the people that can speak to these issues. So finding, one or two guests isn't hard. Scheduling them, huge pain in the ass. Finding them, not difficult.
Yeah, but we usually wind up with like, cool, in July, we're talking about this topic. In August, we're talking about this topic. In September, we're talking about this. And that might change 5 times before that actually happens because, so-and-so can't do July, or this person backed out of August, or they're no longer in that job anymore, kind of a deal. But we at least have a running list of topics and a running list of people who have said, yes, I'd love to be on the show. And it's fairly easy given our roles to match those people up.
Yeah, the only huge hurdle we have is because we're not working with developers, we're not working with DevOps engineers so much as working with people who are doing a lot of community things. Is towards the end of the year, especially, we start to see people like, listen, I can't do your show. I'm so burnt out, like I can barely see straight. I've been to 11 airports in 14 days, and I'm going to have to drop out. And that's kind of the sad side effect of what it is that we do.
We were early on in the sort of DevOps, as was Food Fight Show. So I would just go around San Francisco or wherever I was on the streets and say, do you know what DevOps is? And if you said yes, you got on the show. So
I think for Food Fight, there's 2 big sources for guests, at least for me. One is Nathan and I both go to a lot of conferences, speak at a lot of conferences, and harvesting the conference speaker list, I think, is a time-honored tradition for podcasts, particularly someone who sounds interesting, and we can get an idea of what their cadence is, how they kind of talk. The other major source is the best thing about Chef is the Chef community. And I've seen Nathan do this over the years. I've tried to do it myself. Often when we're looking to flesh out a panel, we pull people directly from the community. I think, Nathan, I remember we were doing an episode on InSpec, I think, and Paul Welch, who now works at Chef, had asked a question in the Chef community Slack, and Nathan reached out to him and said, hey, I'm talking about InSpec tomorrow. You had a question about that. You want to be on the show? And he was on the show.
Yeah, so, we definitely try to do that. And then the other thing that we try to do is we just look around. Certainly in the early days, we looked around and said, who do we want to talk to? I bet if we ask them, they'll come on a podcast. They probably wouldn't talk to us if I just picked up the phone and called them. But if I ask them to come on a podcast, maybe they'll do that. And it totally works. It was awesome.
Flattery will get you a long way.
For Go Time, one aspect of how we invite guests is very opportunistic. For example, if some initiative from the Go team gets launched, we will find the proper person to invite and talk about it. For example, they just launched a new branding strategy, and we got the person who led the initiative to come and talk about it. If there is a meaningful new feature or major improvement to the language, we'll find the proper person to talk about it. On the other hand, one thing that we tended to do a lot was just think about someone who we knew. The community is sort of small still, especially at the beginning. We started the Go Time FM podcast 2 years ago. We would think of someone and just say, we need to have this person on the show because we knew they have so much to talk about. But it was sort of unfocused because then we had to think about what are we going to, I mean, they can talk about a billion things. What are we going to actually talk about on the show? And our producer was trying to move us in the direction of picking a topic first and then find a person to talk about that topic, which is what was said here. So we were trying to move in that direction. And that requires more discipline. It requires more thinking. It's much easier to just latch on to a person. Oh, that person hasn't been on the show yet. Let's bring them in.
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that when we started doing ADO, and if you kind of take the walk through our episode history, you'll see that the first year especially is very topic oriented, right? In terms of the we'd come up with this topic and then figure out who could we scramble for. And a lot of that had to do with just sort of the way Trevor and I were putting the show together and us not knowing people as much as that happened. And that was one of the things that was great when Bridget joined, because her Rolodex, so to speak, was larger than ours at the time. The other thing that happened over time is we started doing more of the fireside chat episodes as well, which those would be the ones where we didn't really go with a topic first. We'd just say, okay, you know what? We just need to get Paul on the show. And it's not because we just want to talk to him for an hour about stuff. And the truth that I've started to discover is that I think Trevor, I can't speak for you as much, but I know Bridget and I have started to fall into this pattern of wanting to do these because they are certainly a lot easier. Doing a one-on-one episode is so much easier from a logistical standpoint than, as PJ alluded to, than when you're trying to get an all skate with all the hosts plus a panel of a couple people. And
that's why.
Thank you for the phrase "all skate."
Yes. Now reverse.
That's why I usually wait for you to tell me what episode's next.
Yeah.
And why, as the one-on-one episodes are becoming more frequent, my appearances have become less.
Hey, Clarecia, you mentioned that you have a producer, which I think is pretty awesome and reminds me that we are an amateur podcast. Do you have a director also? Because I think we could use a director to stop us from stepping over each other.
Yeah.
Well, you must know the changelog, yeah? It's the Go Time belongs to the changelog, so they produce that show, our show.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
Actually, about that. So when you say there's a producer, what does that mean? Is that somebody does the editing or?
A lot of everything. So I guess changelog's been around for a few years, and then they switched to like a media company where they're producing several podcasts. So they do all of the post-production work for us. They handle the CMS and all of that jazz. And they brought somebody on to help with scheduling at one point so that we can kind of be like, we want to get this person on, help us get these people on the schedule.
Right. Yeah, and here's the reason I asked.
There is also someone who does the transcript manually.
Oh, yeah.
It's not automated.
Yeah, the reason I ask is, and this might bleed into the next question about how do you decide what to talk about on your show, but we and this is a question for everyone. We found that when we started, it was very focused on we want to get an individual, like we want that person on the show. And then over time, it kind of shifted to we want to talk about that topic. So then it was, okay, who would want to talk about that topic? And I ended up having a producer role, but it was very different than that, the kind of production aspect. It was more, and that's why I asked, it was more, and this role rotated among the kind of co-hosts, where somebody would structure out the agenda for the episode and they would put, these are the questions or the things I want to discuss. And they might, kind of structure it a little bit so that when we all showed up, only one person really had to do kind of the initial legwork to have the episode. So that's why I was, is that familiar with
Yeah. So as the hosts, we still do that. We
Mm-hmm.
still come up with what we're going to talk to them about. Here's kind of the rough agenda. We're going to talk about these things and flow into some other thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
joke.
and we
We're
on
paid.
Community Pulse, we kind of
Similar
trade that
process.
responsibility a little bit. Like it tends to be like I'll bring up a topic that I'm really, really passionate about, that I really want to talk to people about. And like I'll have maybe one person that I know is going to be amazing on that episode, right? And then someone else will bring in the second guest, kind of a deal. And then whoever came up with the original topic, if it was me, then I usually take the first pass at, you know, scheduling the agenda and sending out or writing up the agenda and sending out the schedule and being the main point of contact and all of that. But yeah, as far as the scheduling and getting a hold of people and all of that, that's all us. And what you all are talking about sounds incredible right now.
Yeah, that only started recently.
Well, don't get us wrong. We were doing the scheduling up to very, very recently.
Yeah, just a couple months ago.
And at the beginning, we were doing the show notes ourselves. I mean, when I did it, I would listen to the whole episode. I'll get the audio before it was edited. Yeah. I'll go through the whole unedited audio, listen to it and stop and copy the links.
Right.
Because I was really bad at doing it on the fly as the show was going on. So I had to do it afterwards. But then later they brought someone. I mean, they took that over and did it, and I was very glad.
Yeah, they've got
show notes are the hardest thing, right? We've tried lots of different things. We've tried doing it ourselves, and for a while, I think I did a pretty good job. And I mean, like the first maybe 6 months, but it would be a matter of sitting and listening through the whole show, taking notes. And I would schedule tweets and I would do all this stuff, and it was grand. And I got really tired of doing it really fast. And then we tried outsourcing it a little bit. In fact, actually, Mary, I stumbled across something. Mary wrote show notes for us for a while. Yeah. And it's great, but it's expensive, you know, to have or people aren't necessarily, you know, we had people who were fine, but then they didn't necessarily stick around to do it and blah, blah, blah. And so then we end up with show notes that now are not even they're more just a place for when we had some links to something, versus I like show notes that I can get a feel for what happened in the episode, but it's a huge amount of effort if you're not getting paid to do it.
It's a big time commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Changelog, I think it's like 6 podcasts they have. So they're probably watching the things that the hosts struggle with across all of them and being like, okay, if we hire some people to do this, maybe we can give them more time to work on these other things.
Right.
So maybe the rest of us should incorporate.
Yeah.
We could have a pod. There's this whole thing, this whole podcast network is an idea that people do, and I've never quite understood why.
And to give listeners some perspective. Sorry, Dal, I just want to mention this real quick. To give listeners perspective on this. So I used to do most of the agendas. I used to do the show notes. I used to do the editing for the ship show. And I would quote, it took anywhere between, depending on an episode and depending on quality issues and all, you know, recording issues, 8 to 10 minutes of production time per minute you heard. So an hour-long podcast would take me about 9 hours to produce. And so I wish we would have had production staff, but I mean, it really, if you want to put on a sort of quality podcast with editing and show notes that are useful and transcripts, we never did transcripts because I couldn't imagine doing that. And I apologize for it, but I just would have made my head explode. It's a chunk of time.
Yes.
Yeah. We, probably for the first year and a half, we did everything except post-production. So we never had to edit audio files, which I'm thankful for. But yeah, everything else we've done, and it's kind of been peeled away in layers. And the transcription thing I think we have is open source, isn't it? Is that part of the CMS where it does the auto transcription? And then
it's not, there is a human involved in that. I don't know if there's also an automated thing going on, but there is definitely a human.
There's services to do that, and they're not terribly expensive. We did it for a while because, and this is just a little tricksy trick, by the way. Like some podcasters will do this thing where they'll do transcription, and their show notes will be the transcription, and that's actually bad for your SEO. You're better off like linking to them. But I've seen a lot of stuff lately with a lot of people being really appreciative of when there are transcripts. If you have audio issues yourself, if you have if you're hard of hearing or anything like that, to be able to have that. So I think it's something we should probably revisit ourselves with all of our copious funding, which mostly goes to our editor.
The other cool thing.
Sorry, Eric. It's not that I want to raise the bar or anything, but if you guys go on the transcript for any of the episodes, for any of the shows that the changelog produces, at the beginning of the paragraph, there will be a link to the place in the audio where there is. It's really cool.
Yeah, and all of our transcripts actually they get done, but then they go on GitHub where people can submit PRs to fix them for us.
So I cut Nell off, and she's been trying to get. What were you going to say? I'm sorry about that, by the way.
It's all good. I wanted to specifically call out Mandy Moore, who's at the Ruby Rep on Twitter. She handles our editing. Fantastic. We handle the show notes and such, but a great thing she did once was I did a live podcast recording at Microsoft Ignite Australia, and I didn't realize it when I was recording, but we got some background music in the recording, and she was able to edit all of that out within hours. So if you're looking for editing, highly recommend her.
Amazing work. Yeah, not the Mandy Moore you're thinking of from the 90s. It's a different Mandy Moore, but still super awesome.
I've got sound stuck in my head now, so thanks for that.
Mandy did post-production for us for quite some time until we decided to keep it in the family. And so Joe, who's Bridget's husband, is our audio editor. So I think we figured, he and one of the things that's really great, I got really worried when I turned over the editing to him because I'd started doing these cold opens, and I was kind of concerned. I'm like, is Joe going to, be knowledgeable enough about our stupid jokes to, figure out what's going to be funny to put in there? And, in retrospect, it was a completely unfounded fear because he travels with Bridget to all these conferences and he knows all the silly DevOps jokes, and he's actually way better at this than I am. So my favorite thing about getting an audio edit from Joe is to find out what he picked for the cold open. That's basically all I care about with our show. So
the one thing I'll mention that I did do all the editing, and my roommate can attest to the fact that he would hear cussing at 2 a.m. He would go get up and get a glass of water, and he'd hear cussing from my room, and it was because I was editing the ship show at 4 a.m. But the one thing it does allow you to do, which we always got feedback on, and it was one of my favorite parts of editing, was I got to pick the music. So I picked themes for the music of the show and tried to kind of match it to something, if nothing else, just have the music be thematically coherent in some way. And that was a lot of fun. And whenever everyone was like, oh, your ship show music's so good, I was like, oh, makes all that 4 a.m. stuff seem worth it somehow.
I will always take editing from Joe if I feel like I sounded really stupid throughout the show. And then I will take the editing where I'll be like, no, it's cool. I got this episode because I know I can go clean myself up.
If we did that on Community Pulse, I wouldn't be in any of the episodes.
We did an episode that my now ex was on, and after we were done recording it, she very correctly pointed out that I had been very not nice to her during the episode, not on purpose, but she's like, you came across sounding like a real jerk. And I was like, thank you for post-production. I first immediately apologized and then turned around and said, I will fix that in post, and no one will know except for the couple people on the show. So speaking about that, what's really been any surprising things from doing the show? Any things that you weren't expecting?
It's a lot of fun when someone recognizes me by my voice at conferences.
Yeah.
Yep, that was what I was going to say. Yep.
Yeah.
And the thing I noticed too was it would always be at a conference when I was very animated, because I guess I'm animated on the podcast. So I'd be like, well, release engineering, blah, and they'd be like, I hear that, so.
The most interesting ones to me is when I'm not at like a Go conference, like I'm at like a security conference or something, and somebody behind me walks around and they're like, go time? Yeah.
I think the most interesting feedback I've had is not so much at a conference, but we recently closed the CFP for a conference I'm running called Code Days. And we added an additional question that was just, why do you want to speak at this conference? And a lot of people were like, well, I heard about it on the Community Pulse. And I was like, damn, we have listeners. Like I immediately jumped into Slack and I was like, Mary, you're not going to believe this, but people are saying they listen to us. And now I feel like I've affected lives that aren't my children. And maybe this was the whole podcast thing was a mistake. What was I thinking?
Say that as the biggest surprise that people actually listen to it?
Well, and I think that's the truth for us, at least. Like Jason and I started this and we brought PJ on in what, episode 8, I think?
Yeah,
and
7 or 8, somewhere in there.
It was totally this, like, we want to do this because we want to learn more and we want to have these conversations, and we might as well have them out in the open because it's like someone mentioned earlier, it's easier to get people on the phone if they're recording a podcast and not just talking to you, right? But also, like, it's potentially valuable for other people, but like hearing people actually say, no, that was a super interesting, super valuable episode, or like, I'll go through the DevRel hashtags every once in a while when I'm pulling stuff for my DevRel weekly newsletter, and like I'll see conversations where people are talking about topics that we mentioned on the podcast, and I'm like, I do the same thing as PJ did. You guys, you're never gonna believe it. Someone's talking about the podcast and they didn't bring us up.
Or even from that. Or even like, you know, somebody DMs you on Twitter or DMs the Community Pulse account. And they're like, hey, we really like that you talked about blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, did we talk about blah? That was like 7 months ago. Holy crap. Or
Not only are they listening, but they're listening to the archived episode.
Yeah, evergreen, man. The weirdest one that started to happen is there's some cat who like goes and creates like visualizations of quotes from our show and tweets them. And you know,
that's amazing.
That's awesome.
And I'm sure it's all to try to get people to follow his Twitter and everything, but it's still super cool. And I was just like, wow, that's like someone sat and because I do that. I don't even do that for our show anymore because it was too much of a pain in the butt. You know, and I'm like, some dude's doing that. So, all right.
Hey, nobody does that for our show. Come on, people.
We did have those people.
We deserve it too.
It's always
Argentina.
Amazing.
Yes, I did get a bottle of wine. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Great.
It's always amazing to me, especially like when we first got started, just the credibility that you get for no reason for saying you're part of a podcast. Oh, I'm on Arrested DevOps. Oh, I haven't heard of it, but you're on a podcast and you talk about DevOps. Clearly, you know what you're talking about.
Expert alert.
Yeah.
And here's a media pass to go to the conference.
which is funny because in our case, like, you know, we're working in a very greenfield area of evangelism in DevRel. It's only been around a few years. So people are like, wow, you must be an expert. It's like, Jesus Christ, no, that's not even possible. That's like people who are like, yeah, Go development. I've been doing that for 25 years. It's like, no, you haven't. That's
how you know you're an expert when you can
exactly
it, right?
I've been doing Rails since 1992. It's like, no, really, wow. That's
has anyone had this experience? It's related to that where you finish a podcast and you think to yourself, it wasn't one of our better ones. Like it was okay, and you're like, and then you edit it together and you're like, I'm still not happy with it. And then you post it and people are like, this is the most amazing. And they're tweeting it. And you're like, well, okay, sure. I was a genius. It was great.
There's funny ones like that. So partway through ours, we started recording live, and like some of the most interesting stuff is that like, we'll have like pre-show and after show, and the people who listen live get to be in on that. And like, that's the thing everybody wants to listen to. And we have these weird conversations about stuff like what we're binge watching on Netflix, and Brian and I ragging on each other. And then like, we'll do like an AMA, like ask us anything about Go or distributed systems or any of that stuff. And they will ask us about like what we like to eat.
Yeah. We get barbecue questions.
Yeah, it's interesting to get that kind of feedback. For a while we were putting our podcasts out, like we would use Zoom and record them because we weren't brave enough to do shit live. We're not that clever. But we would put them up, and for a while we were actually taking everything from before and after and doing like almost like a bloopers reel, like a gag reel afterwards. And I know from both Community Pulse and an internal podcast I used to do when I worked at another company, those are the parts people watched. Like they found that so much more not informative. That's definitely not the right word. Engaging, hilarious. And I think it adds like a human aspect from, you know, it's a different thing from like, oh, you're up on stage and you're talking about a subject or you're on the podcast, you're talking on the subject, and you're like, hello, yes, welcome to the news, and I'm going to talk about exactly the subject we're talking about. To like, I'm a regular person, and I have like salsa on my shirt, and that's the way it's going to be. And Mary's laughing because we made another joke about her dog. Like that's
But there is
Mary laughs at anything though.
There is an aspect to this, and we found this on the ship show where you come on the show when you start the show and you're just kind of being yourself, and then after a while those jokes and why you laugh at certain things becomes this sort of more three-dimensional personality, which may or may not entirely be who you actually are. You know what I mean? And so like the running joke was like Seth Thomas was always the kind of screw up of the ship show. And we loved him. He'd show up and he'd be, pouring bourbon during the show and you'd hear him, and the way he giggled, he was just kind of like the class clown of the panel. Right. And so it's interesting to kind of, that's, you're asking about what's surprising. There is this aspect of your sort of public persona developing in a way that you don't intend and maybe not super control. It's just people sort of assume, oh, he's the class clown, or she's whatever the expert on this particular topic, whereas you're like, I just was talking about it,
And then there's the consequence of, are you going to run with this, or is it something you're going to? Is this going to be a divisive thing? Right. I in my career, like I was blessed with this persona of PJ, and once upon a time I had a real name and a last name. It was amazing, but I don't have those things anymore, and I turned the whole thing around and made a company out of it. But I know a lot of people that are like, you know what, I don't want to do this kind of stuff anymore. I'm going to drop the podcast. I'm not going to do DevRel. I'm going to go back to coding full time and never talking to anyone and living in a cave. Mm-hmm. So it in a way, and I hate to make this, it's like being a musician. Like there's a level of stardom, and you have to decide whether you're going to embrace that or run away from it.
The other thing too is when we look at like surprising things, is what might be surprising to the listener, which might also be when we talk about having a personality, is like how much of introverts some of us actually are. And they're like, but you seem so outgoing and charismatic on the show. And you're like, yeah, it's,
that's because I don't have to look at your face while I'm recording the podcast. I can just do that in my room while I hug my cat.
I've been really aware of this recently, and in several of the conferences I was at, is that I've had people come up, and as they do at a DevOps conference, a lot of people know about the show, which is awesome. And when I'm talking, I'm just sort of like not in a person place, because I'm in that like second day of the conference, ready to retreat away from all humans. And which I'm sure is a very different experience than when they encounter Trevor at a conference and he's huge and bigger than life, which it is the difference of saying like, yeah, it could be surprising to find out that the person behind the mic is
it's really interesting. I think I was actually going to type this in the chat, that I think people are surprised, like you were just saying, at conferences that you're kind of quiet and reserved, and I do the talking, as opposed to the other way around, where on the podcast you do all the talking and I just kind of sit here and make crack jokes.
I don't think we have that. I think on our podcast we're all pretty much exactly who you see on the podcast in public, because see, any one of you who has met Mary before, this is Mary. This is not. You will say something, Mary will laugh, and then come up with a very poignant thing that she realized that because you said something stupid. But seriously, like that's like when people, and it's very rare the three of us have ever been in the same place at the same time, but that's kind of our personalities. That's what we do. We are a brand for a company professionally. In many ways, that's kind of what we do. So on the podcast, we're really no different than when you meet us in public. But I think that's we're kind of an exception to the rule compared to most people who have this public life and then life in public, which is two very separate things.
Even with the public thing, though, like Brian and I are both developer advocates, so we go out and speak and things like that. But sometimes you're kind of putting on a show on stage, and then you kind of get in your like introverted mode where you're peopled out for a little bit. And...
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there's some little personality quirks and things like that. Like PJ was joking about bullet points earlier, and like that came up 4 episodes ago now.
Let me check my bullet points.
That we were in the pre-show notes, and some of the bullet points started like 2 tabs in, and some of them started 1.5 tabs in, and some of them were like non-existent completely.
Let me translate. Let me just translate. It was a goddamn mess. It was a disgusting, disgusting mess.
But I was very quietly going through and fixing things, and someone goes, hold up. Mary, are you fixing all the bullet points? And I was like, well, yeah, because it's wrong. Like, they're not okay. And I know Paul can attest to this because we've worked on a conference together. And but it's funny, like that never comes up in person because that's all stuff that normally just goes on in my head that I handle with my own docs and my own time, and it's not a big deal. And now suddenly I think that's come up in every single episode since that happened on our show, and it came up here as well. So like
are the bullet points good for you?
That and the fact that Jason Hand and I will be doing the audio for Mary's unreleased book. We'll be doing an audio book where Jason and I read the book.
Yes.
So, Jason in a slower Southern draw, I mean a faster New York, like what you need, what you want.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things I like about podcasting the most is I have a little bit of hearing loss. So when you come to me at a conference, particularly at the after party, if it's at a bar, you might see me kind of nodding and just listening, but it's because I'm getting every third word. The wonderful thing about podcasting is I can turn all of you up as much as I need. And with some software, I can even turn some of you up and others of you down. And it's a great way to have a conversation because I have complete control over the environment that the conversation is happening in.
That is cool.
I think one thing, and if you're thinking about doing a podcast or kind of the theme here that's interesting, that is surprising to me, is that when you start a podcast, and especially if it's video, but even if it's not, you're really inviting people into your life in a way that is hard to fully understand the ramifications of that. So for instance, you will have people that will look at the video and they'll zoom in on, what books you have on your bookshelf. In fact, I can see an algorithms book, right? Is that the algorithms book on your bookshelf? So people will like look at things that you're like, I can't believe somebody did that to find that detail. And so sometimes it can be surprising, and sometimes it can just be, oh, Mary needs to have all the bullet points lined up. And it's funny, right? But that is one of the things that I think is surprising and unexpected. And if you're going to do it, you should be prepared for people to point things out, like what your verbal tick is. What was my verbal tick? We all have that, right?
I thought it was more J. Paul Reed reporting to you from undisclosed location with white hotel background. I'm just saying.
Yes.
We also get you a co-host who will see those things for you, because Bridget is amazing for that. There'd be many times we'd be doing the show and we'd be green rooming before, and she would say, Stratton, I can see dirty laundry behind you. Or I can see this, and it will be, or usually sit still, man. Sit still.
I would do the right verbal tick. Right. Yep. Right. Yeah. Right.
What would I'd like to we can go back.
That's fantastic.
Fantastic.
You do that in real life too, dude.
He does.
This is true.
It's interesting, Paul. I have the right tick as well, and you don't really you understand it as a doing your own show, but when you edit your own show, you find every little thing wrong with how you speak.
Well, and I used to be able to. It's funny. I started being able to hear other people's, like other co-hosts' verbal ticks, right? And it was very funny that some people would repeat certain words. There was almost a stutter, but not really, right? And you would, edit that or massage around it or whatever. But it was just interesting. That's another way. Honestly, that's another way that you invite people into your life when you do this sort of public performance, even if it's about, something related to tech.
Well,
go ahead, PJ.
Oh, sorry. And I think one of the things that makes it interesting is because you are letting someone in, is this idea that they have this concept that you know each other, maybe before you've actually physically met in real life. Like, I know that from various podcasts and blog posts, I knew Nell years before we ever ran into each other in real life. So there's like this awkwardness at first. But with the podcast, it's different. I've noticed that people have no problem approaching you like, hey, we're totally hanging out right now because we are best friends and you have been in my ear for the past 6 months. And therefore we have an intimate relationship. And it's like, yo, I don't know you. So I'm uncomfortable with your strange hangy outiness advances.
But that could have the opposite effect too. Like people who would otherwise approach you at a conference will not, because you're host of a podcast.
Yeah, that is the other side. Like, oh my God, like let's put this person on a pedestal.
Yeah.
They were
Don't
on a
do that.
podcast. They must be
Yeah.
amazing. But I cut Nell off again, which is apparently the theme of the podcast.
It's all good. I was just going to say, one of the things that gets me is, so as some of you know, my mother is from North New Jersey, Bayonne, New Jersey, and has a very strong Jersey accent. Whenever I hear a recording of myself speaking, I can hear bits of her voice and accent coming out of my mouth. And it's kind of the uncanny valley sometimes. I'm hearing my mother's voice, even though I was the one who was saying those words.
This is a food fight show. How you doing?
Exactly.
So on those same lines, I actually have a twin brother, so I'm used to hearing my own voice.
I think I've realized after editing the podcast enough that if I had a twin, I would have killed him.
The thing is, you need to have your twin on the podcast as you and see if anyone notices. Just talking about
Maybe he has.
Maybe. Yeah, it's true.
Maybe this is his twin right now.
You blew my mind.
Wow.
So what I'd like to know is what you're listening to, or who inspires you in the kind of podcast world. What are some of your favorite shows? And they don't necessarily have to be tech related or DevOps or advocacy related or anything in your sphere. But I always like to hear something, and especially who's inspiring, either from what they have to do or what they are doing.
For me, I'll go first because I look like I'm first in line. I don't know how the hell Hangouts works, but whatever. So for me, it's two things, and Mary got me into one, and that's the Crime Town podcast. Beyond loving the story and the really interesting real history of all places, Providence, Rhode Island, like the way that they do it, the flow of it is so nice. So I look to that as like, it's a very professionally done, very high level thing. And not all the audio is great because some of it's from like the late 70s and 80s and was like, a tabletop tape recorder from back then. But they managed to mix it in and make it really good. The other podcast that I listen to regularly is based on a radio show I used to listen to as a kid called The Ongoing History of New Music. It's from a radio station in Toronto called 102.1. Best radio station in the world. You should check it out. But it's hosted by this guy, Alan Cross. And the amount of research that he does on bands and music that you think you know, and his ability to bring it all up, tie it into a story, and totally blow you away with the stuff you did not know is just fantastic. The podcast is good. If you can get the actual radio version, it's better because on the podcast, for licensing reasons, he can't play full songs, and that's really a part of the story. But yeah, I mean, currently he's doing like I think he's on part 8 of the 90s, and it's like reliving the 90s all over again. It's so awesome. But yeah, Alan Cross, The Ongoing History of New Music, and Crime Town, both fantastic podcasts that I really take to heart when we work on Community Pulse.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's pretty much anything by Gimlet Media is amazing. If you aren't familiar, it's a podcasting company started by some folks who came out of NPR. The favorite one of mine that they produced, there we go, is called Reply All. And it's tech related, but not in the tech side of things that we function with. It's like how things work and the weird random websites of someone who lost their pug and how they wound up finding their pug. And so it's storytelling that happens as a result of the internet and as a result of technology, not necessarily tech related. But again, like Crime Town, the way that it's edited, the stories that they do, the interviews that they do, it's produced incredibly well, but it's also just incredibly engaging, and it's consistently one that like they announced over the summer, because I think both of the hosts were having kids this summer, and so like they announced, hey, we're going to be releasing them like as we can, and so like consistently every week I'm like, do you have a new? Damn it, there's not a new episode out. Okay. But yeah, that's definitely one of my favorites.
I very much grew up on NPR. Again, as some of you know, both my parents were military. We moved around quite a bit. And NPR, the voices of NPR were one of the very few consistencies throughout my life. And I'd say my biggest inspiration from there is Terry Gross with Fresh Air. The way, the way she's able to put, you can hear it. She's so skilled at putting the interviewee at ease. Like I've listened to episodes where she's asked a celebrity a question and that celebrity is known to walk out of interviews if anyone asks about it, but she can ask it in such a way that she can get an answer in a way that, in a voluntary way, in a way that the guest feels comfortable. My favorite episode of the Food Fight show we've done was we had Kelsey Hightower for our Kubernetes episode. And it was so fun. It was one of the rare one-on-one episodes. I think, Nathan, you were at an airport and the Wi-Fi was terrible. So eventually I took over it. But getting to ask the general questions everyone wants to know from Kelsey Hightower, and then really listening to him and picking up on little things he said, and then gently probing at those to get more information. I mean, it's my favorite episode we've done, and I think I've heard from people it was one of our best episodes.
I'm looking forward to all these links.
Yeah.
All right, I can go.
Oh, go, Carlicia.
Yeah.
Eric, I'm always cutting you off, even in somebody else's podcast. Unbelievable.
Hey, we're the same, right? On our show, on other people's shows. It's the roles we play.
The roles we play. I'm an avid podcast consumer. And, what I listen to depends on my mood, what time of the day, if I want to wake up, if I want to learn, if I want to just chill, if I want to validate my choices. But out of everything, I have a bunch of tech stuff that I wouldn't bring any of those up, but I want to mention 3. One is none of them are tech related. One is Esther Perel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. She's French. And she talks about relationships. Couple relationships, and another one is Byron Katie. She invites you to question what the truth is. A lot of times we say, well, you're a jerk because, and she'll say to you, is that true? Because at the end of the day, or bottom line is how you react to things that happen to you. Which sounds completely reasonable, right? Like we get that, but it's so incredibly hard to really practice. And the third one is called The Way I Heard It with Mike Rowe, Rowe, R-O-W-E. Don't know how to pronounce that. And they're very short episodes, and he jumps into a story that draws you in, and at the end, there's a big revelation that, well, at least I never see it coming, and it's mind-boggling. And because they're very short, it's just delicious to listen to. So
I know it's super cliche, but I like This American Life. And the reason I like This American Life is I don't tend to listen to a lot of podcasts, but you cannot listen to it for 6 months and jump right into it. And it's super accessible, and this type of the way the story's threaded is always great. So it's a good, like, okay, I'm going to be on a plane and whatever. The other one, and I know this is, I don't want to bring everyone down, but I do love this podcast. So there's a podcast called What Trump Can Teach Us About con law being constitutional law. And it's hosted by Roman Mars, who I think does 99% Invisible podcast as well. And the reason I like it is because they have a constitutional law professor walk through. So there's some issue, Trump does something crazy, and they talk very actually little about him. They go back into the history of old cases where they bring, like they did an episode on Kenny Pardon himself. So they go back and look at all of the cases that the Supreme Court has ever looked at related to pardons. And so the majority of that podcast is actually historical stories about weird cases that, the punchline is like the Supreme Court had to decide is a burrito a burger or not, right? I mean, there's these weird historical, like, wait, that's the case, right? So that podcast I really like, and 99% Invisible too, obviously, but
it's no surprise to Trevor and probably some of the rest of you on the show that I listen to a lot of podcasts about podcasting. At least I used to. There's a great one called The Audacity to Podcast, and he's been kind of off air, so to speak, for quite some time. I think there was some personal things happen, but it's a great show. But one of the ones I really love is called Podcasters Roundtable, and it's kind of like this except much more structured. But what they'll do is it's a couple guys who do a show about podcasting, and I don't know the podcasting world well enough to know these names, but they'll bring on all kinds of different folks to talk about a topic, and it'll be these, big name sports podcasters talking to someone who does a podcast for their tiny little town in Wales that has a listenership of 100 people at the same time, and it's all on this equal footing of talking about different problem sets and different challenges, and it's a really interesting way to hear different stories about different shows. So I really like that one a lot.
So it'll come to no surprise to Matt that I will admit that I listen to no podcasts, but I have been starting to watch some YouTube channels, and the one I've been really into that kind of fits the vein of podcasting. I don't need to listen to myself talk, Matt, like you. So Matt is in our chat saying that, we're pointing out that I don't even listen to our own show, but the point is I do listen to our show when I'm on it. And that's good enough. I don't need to hear my voice like you do. But anyway, this YouTube channel is called Techmoan, and this person finds old audio video equipment and explains what it is and what it did, and it goes through like all these strange video formats. Like,
wait, what is that called?
Techmoan.
Techmoan, because I was going to say there's one called Technology Connections, which is the same thing. He did like a 4-part series on why Laserdisc failed. But like you, I love that stuff. No, it's amazing. Like he did a big one on like how TV works, and I was like, well, I never actually knew.
Yeah, like he'll go through these like really bizarre formats that like lasted for like half a year and then failed. Or like weird like variants of vinyl that came out because it was supposed to be a higher audio quality but required a special encoder, and it failed because of that. And some like going through all the history and the detail of it, and like he'll have an actual unit from whatever it was, and he'll kind of like he'll show you like what the audio sounds like, and then he'll point out that you're hearing the audio through YouTube. So depending on how you've got YouTube set up, you may or may not be hearing the right thing. But like it's super detailed and super interesting, and I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in that kind of like technology history.
There are certain YouTube channels and certain podcasts like that like I never expected anyone to donate, but they have a Patreon. I'm like, I would donate to that because it's like, there's just the work that you're like, wow, and to research it and to buy the equipment and then to pull it all apart. You're just like, that's amazing. And also you apparently have no life. But thank you for not having a life, because I learned something.
Well, at least they're teaching you something, and they're not telling you whether or not it'll blend.
Yes.
Oh my God, that was the best
Classic.
YouTube channel in history.
Oh my God.
It wasn't even actually a YouTube channel.
It was just a.
Yeah,
We'll have to find.
It's just a brilliant moment in time. A brilliant
But now
moment
we
we can never get back.
Now we have the hydraulic press channel instead.
Ooh, yeah.
There's one now with a hydraulic press?
Yeah, a hydraulic press going through a stack of CDs. Oh, it's beautiful.
So I feel like we
Like
somehow
AOL
just got into
CDs.
that. I realize that question basically is just a big checkouts question. It was not what I was looking for. So I have one last kind of question we'll go around with, and then we'll go into checkouts. And as we joked during our green room time, we could do our intros and our checkouts, and that would be an episode. And that might be kind of what we did here. But what advice would any of you have for someone who wanted to start a tech podcast?
I would say make sure you know the commitment that you're making. Like it is not a build it and they will come situation at all in any way.
You need to get them.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of spare time. It's a lot of Even like we don't do, I say we, and it's PJ who does all of it, but like we don't do a lot of post-production work. I have never touched the audio for our show, and I never intend to touch the audio for our show, but like there's a lot that goes into it, right? You need a website. You need to fight with iTunes on occasion when they go and lose your data. They need, all of the syndication stuff, all of the figuring out where to host everything, how to pull people in, how to, get people to understand that you have a show, all of that. It's a lot of work, and it's totally worth it, and I love it. But I'd be lying if I said that there weren't a couple times that we've actually sat down and gone, is this really something we want to continue doing?
We've definitely been close. Yeah.
And with that in mind too, like the cadence, right? So like we do weekly, and I think in hindsight, it's a lot of trying to come up with new guests, new topics,
that's a career.
It is. It's work.
So everybody was all, you have a producer, you're so lucky. Well, in exchange, we also have 4 episodes a month.
Yeah.
So that was actually going to be my advice that, and I heard this both from podcasters and listeners. It doesn't matter what the cadence is. It matters that you keep a cadence. So people are going to be fine if it's once a month, once every couple months. They may even be excited if it's just once a month. But if you do one every 6 months and then you release like 12 in 2 weeks and then you are silent for 4 months, the problem is that there's people just can't get into it, and they get into this like, I can't consume that much, and I don't want to consume 4 episodes in a month as opposed to, and then have nothing for whatever. And so if you're really interested in building an audience and continuing it, pick a cadence and stick with it, and always do that, even if it's once a month, even if it's once every other month.
I would plead guilty as charged here. The Food Fight Show is definitely, probably, I can't speak for everyone, but I can proudly say that it is pretty inconsistent in terms of how often and frequently we re-release. I always joke that we practice continuous delivery. As soon as an episode is available, we ship it. Sometimes that means you get 3 episodes a week. Sometimes it means you get 6 episodes in a year. And like, I understand everything that you said, Paul, and why that's terrible. Also, that's what works for me. And
right. Well, so let me be clear. I actually want to be really clear about that. My advice is, if you want to build an audience and you're having trouble with that, a cadence helps with that. I think there's not a cadence for, the Go podcast is every week, right? But I know Arrested DevOps has bunches, some episodes up when they go to a lot of events. No,
you're actually hitting onto a very sore subject within our show about we have our co-host that is not with us believes in the Nathan Harvey school of continuous delivery, which is pump it out as soon as it's done. I am we release the show on every other Thursday type of cadence.
Well, and so
what ends up happening is somewhere kind of in between where we try to,
all I would say
like twice a month.
Point, it's like whatever you do, whatever works for you. I mean, because honestly, the reason the ship show ended is because we couldn't maintain the cadence that was necessary, and people kind of got burnt out on it, and that's something that can happen too. But if you are trying to build an audience and you're having trouble with that, and you are inconsistent, going to I will release a podcast every other Thursday or whatever it is, actually can help with that, because then people get excited that, hey, I know on Thursday I'm going to go, my Thursday workout is going to have Matt Stratton's voice in my ear.
And back to the original question of advice to give to people who want to start a technical podcast. My advice is don't start a technical podcast. Figure out what it means, and it's easy to do that. Look, you've got Arrested DevOps, you've got the Food Fight Show, you've got Community Pulse. If you want to do a technical podcast, come help us. We would love to have you on. In fact, Nell is on the Food Fight Show because she said, hey, I'd like to get involved with that. I said, well, I don't care to schedule them, so Why don't we work together? And maybe you can guilt me into having more episodes and vice versa. And that totally works. And so if you want to know what really happens behind the scenes, don't listen to this episode to figure that out. Go and help behind the scenes on a podcast. Go do that. And then decide, like, what are the goals that you have for the podcast? Are you in it for you? Are you in it to build an audience? And be very clear about those as you go down this journey. So eventually, yes, go start your own podcast. It's going to be amazing, and we're all going to be loyal listeners to it. But tomorrow, don't start one. Just come help us. We'll help give you some insights.
The biggest piece of technical advice that I can give is first step, get an external microphone. It doesn't have to be hugely expensive, but get one that's not embedded in your laptop, and preferably one that's not part of a headset. Second, get what's called a pop filter. If you're watching live, you can see mine right here. That is what keeps your P's and B's from sounding like staccato or a drum or something. And third step, which I'll talk about in my picks, then I'll turn this back over to you, Mary, because I think I cut you off for a change, is to get an audio interface, which will improve the quality of your recording considerably. And I'll be talking about that in my picks. So back to you, Mary.
I was just going to say on Nathan's point about, don't start your own, help us out instead. Like, if there's a topic that you want to talk about and you want to do a different spin on it, cool. Maybe Community Pulse releases twice a month and you fill in the other blanks in there, right? Because you're doing DevRel stuff, or maybe you hook on to the rest of DevOps, or maybe you hook on a Food Fight show and you do the puppet side of Food Fight instead of the chef side. I don't know, whatever. But like building, it's the same thing that I always say about doing communities. Don't try and create your own community. Figure out where your community is and join them there.
You can join the ship show.
I would also add to that, if you're thinking about doing a podcast, I don't care if it's a technical podcast or non-technical podcast, if you're thinking about doing it, go talk to your musician friends first. And this isn't about equipment, and this isn't about the best way to get audio. Find out the shitty parts about being a musician, because those are all also the shitty parts about doing a podcast. Like, yes, you need recording software. It's not just, I'll hook up a Hangout and hope for the best. Like, no, you're going to need audio processing software. You're going to have to listen to yourself say shit like, welcome to the Community Pulse. My name's PJ. You can find me as a Spleenic on Twitter 50 times per episode to make sure that your levels are correct. And having been a musician, like, I kind of understood this coming into podcasts. The fact that, you know what, you go in, you write a song, you record that song, you then listen to that song so many times, you never want to hear that song ever again. Podcasts are exactly the same. By the time I'm done with an episode of Community Pulse, I'm like, man, I hate Community Pulse. But luckily everybody else likes it, so I'm cool with that. The other piece of advice, the other piece of advice I have is learn to listen. I know it's cliche to say, don't just sit there waiting for your turn to speak. I think we all know that I don't even bother with that part. But like, the idea is, if you're really listening to your guests, that's also really who's tuning into your podcast to listen to. They hear you every episode. They hear the bullshit coming from you every single time. Let your guests speak. Let them run on. Keep notes. Follow what they're doing so that when it is your turn to speak, there's no dead air and you're ready to jump right in and say, oh, well, we've got this to talk about. Or, I want to talk about the point you made earlier, blah, blah, blah. You're there as a prompt. Let your guest run on. Let them speak and listen to what they're saying. That's the key to a good podcast.
You periodically push them in a direction, just gentle nudges. But we've had entire topics of a show change just because the guests kind of just went on and we're like, wow, this is good. Let's just run with this. And it works really great. One thing that I want to touch on is kind of like the imposter syndrome side of things. Like, a lot of like the, am I qualified to talk about this and all that? Like, you don't have to pretend to know everything, be who you are, because inevitably that's what people fall in love with when listening to podcasts is the personality. And then in addition to that, like, don't feel like you're going to ask stupid questions, because if you're thinking of the stupid question in your mind, like, there's plenty of your listeners who want to know the answer to that question. So it's not you being dumb and not knowing the answer. Oftentimes you'll ask questions that you know the answer to just so that your guests or your listeners will get to hear the answer.
My advices are, if you're going to start a new podcast, be laser focused on the theme of your podcast. Don't be all over the place. Otherwise, you're not going to get any subscriber because people don't really know, are not going to know what's about. So be super focused. When you choose a name, search to see if there is a Twitter handle for it, if there is a domain name for it. Because even if you don't want to do that stuff, maybe later you will. And good SEO practices. Just start. You will get better with time. And I want to touch on what PJ said about listening. Listening is key if you're going to be having guests. One thing that I dread is asking a question that the guest has already mentioned, because that is such an indication that I wasn't listening. And listening is a skill that you get better with practice. So listen, and never let the guest end talking about something and you just talk about something else afterwards. Always acknowledge what they said, because that, again, demonstrates that you were listening. And it also helps pick up the interest for the listeners, right? Because they tune in. Oh yeah, like sort of like repeat what the last thing that your guest said. It just helps your listeners keep up with the conversation or wake up to the conversation if they dozed off a little. Listening is key.
We talked earlier about asking people to be on the podcast, but another thing you can ask too is for companies or people to sponsor you. Patreon is a thing now. I don't think it's been super successful for us particularly, but the asking people to sponsor us has always been something that we've had success with on ADO.
So put a caveat on that to be honest, I don't think we've really asked anybody that have asked us, which is not supposed to sound arrogant, but that's one of the things. Don't worry. I would say don't worry about things like sponsorship and everything when you're getting started. Worry about having a good product. I think what you find with things like this is just my 2 cents on why we haven't had success with Patreon. There's 2 things. 1, nobody knows about it anyway, barely. And 2, I personally also, I probably wouldn't donate to a Patreon of a product that had sponsorship. You're already getting paid, you know what I mean? So there's kind of one or two. That's a whole other, we could do a whole that could be a podcast about podcasting conversation.
Ooh, we should do that. A podcast about podcasting and sponsorship, but twice as many guests on the panel.
Yes.
Let's go 16.
And we have to talk about metrics, how you're tracking.
Yes.
I can't believe we didn't even get into any of this stuff. And this is all the stuff that like we have, listeners know that we have like our one self-indulgent episode of the year, which is our year-end wrap-up when we actually sit and talk about the how. The exception this year was this past year, Paul and I spent probably about 15 to 20 minutes of the fireside chat episode he was on talking about the science and art and science of podcasting. But yeah, the damn lies in podcast listening statistics.
Congratulations on your millionth Arrested DevOps listener.
We haven't gotten there yet.
No, you have podcast statistics.
I know factually that Community Pulse is listened to by billions and billions of people and one person on SoundCloud.
So I think we need to move into our checkouts. This is turning into a really long episode, which is great.
I think it's a 2-part episode in and of itself.
Do you think we'll actually cut it? Oh, we've never done that before.
It's the first time for everything, Matt.
Maybe say some stuff now that makes it seem like you planned that. Like we'll all pretend like this is the break. Okay, so like remix it.
Right. That's all going to be. This is the challenge I'm going to throw down to Joe, is to edit this and figure out a way to make this be a 2-parter.
Well, it makes it appropriate behind the scenes, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to scrap your plans and start over and do something different than you thought you were going to.
Exactly.
Works.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to do checkouts. And checkouts are this thing when we give you things to check out. And this all goes back to a little Arrested DevOps trivia. Is there was a point when we thought we were going to have puns that had to do with very each part of the episode. And there was like the retrospective, because like it was an agile thing. And then we had the checkouts, because it was like, you know, checking out a branch and all this ridiculous junk. And that's the only thing that's stuck around has been the checkouts.
We do something called Free Software Friday, where we call out an open source project.
That's much better.
Like how you say call out like you're gonna fight them. Like this is the Go podcast, and what's up, Python? What you got?
There you go. I like that idea. My 3 checkouts are our good friend George Miranda has a new book out called The Service Mesh: Resilient Service to Service Communication. And so service mesh, I understand, is a thing, and not just because it's a fun word to make jokes about, like it's a big mesh, you know, your service in a mesh of a service. If you guys should, you can read George's book. We'll have a link in the show notes. I've become a big fan of this thing called Noticed, which for those of us who speak at events, and I think that's a lot of us on the show, it's a great place to curate your talks. And one of the things that I think is very cool about it is on the page for the particular talk, you know, it has a little bit of a sub-page that are tweets that people tweeted about it. And it's got built into it a little search where when you're writing up the little page, you'll click on this thing and it'll find all the tweets, the at messages to you from the 2 days or the day that you already said the event was and you were speaking at. It's been super helpful. And then finally, I'm about halfway through watching the reboot of Lost in Space on Netflix. It's generally not great, but Parker Posey is unsurprisingly amazing, playing Dr. Smith. So it's worth watching for that and for the special effects, and not really for, you know, any type of great story. Brian, what do you have for us?
So I watched the most fun movie I've watched in forever last night, The Forbidden Kingdom, which was from like 2006 or so. The cheesiest kung fu self-parody I've ever seen, with Jackie Chan and Jet Li. And I loved every last second of it. It was awesome. So if you're into the kung fu, you know, 60s vibe kind of movie, it was a lot of fun. Setapp.com, a group of applications that you can buy on the Mac for something like $6 a month. Really cool. Found a bunch of apps on that and thought that was a really great deal. Did that today. One more, rangeleather.com. Bought a Apple Watch strap from my Apple Watch made out of really nice leather from a company in Laramie, Wyoming. Shout out to my people in Wyoming.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Okay, Eric.
Yeah, so I just threw this together last minute. One tool that I use all the time that I'm actually surprised people haven't seen is called direnv, which is really cool because like when you cd into a directory, it essentially is like a bash script that automatically runs for you, which is awesome for having to change environment variables all the time when you're working on multiple projects. So that's really cool if you haven't seen it. And another one I've been playing with, I've been trying to get back into C a little bit. The link, I guess, will be in the show notes. But on GitHub, there's a project called Project-Based Tutorials in C. It has everything from like creating game engines to writing your own TCP stack, writing NES ROMs in C, things like that. So if you want to brush up on some C and build cool stuff doing it, that's going to be fun to check out.
Great. Now I'm going to check out direnv. I already clicked on that link. It looks pretty cool. Carlicia.
I have 3 checkouts. One is this Kubernetes course that my friend Peter Benjamin mentioned to me today. It's an introductory level. Specifically, it's called LFS158, and it's free on edX. And the next thing is this website called statusmoney.com. So you put in all your information, and the site compares where you are in regards to your peers based on age and location, and it'll compare your credit score. It will compare your salary. It will compare your debt and investment level. So it can be very depressing, just warning. And and the last thing is, well, it's World Cup season, people. And I'm leaving here a very funny video about some soccer shootouts between Yale and North Carolina teams. You must watch this. It's hilarious.
Scott Sterling, most amazing soccer player ever.
Yes, right? There we go. Very famous guy.
Mr. Harvey.
Yeah, that Scott Sterling video is pretty awesome. I will double down on that one. But I have two.
I laughed so hard, my stomach was hurting, and then I left. I watched the sec. I didn't want to watch it again because I was feeling sorry for the guy, and then I watched the second time, and I laughed even harder.
That's awesome. So I have two checkouts tonight. The first one is White Coat Captioning at whitecoatcaptioning.com. I recently helped organize DevOps Days DC, and we had Amanda from White Coat Captioning come and did live closed captioning of all of the presentations at the conference. And it was an incredible experience. Probably one of my favorite moments was watching people come in the room, and I know that they thought to themselves or tweeted, wow, DevOps Days has some really cool AI. They're capturing every word that the speakers are saying. And then they looked over to the back of the room and they realized that the AI's name was Amanda, and she wasn't artificial. She was right there in the room, and you could go and talk to her. And it was super awesome. And so if you're running a conference, I highly, highly recommend that you look into White Coat Captioning. It's an amazing way to make your conference more accessible to everyone. And it has nothing to do, frankly, with whether or not there are people in the room that are hearing impaired. The first time I saw this happening live at a conference, I had that question to myself, I wonder how many people are hearing impaired here, and isn't this a great service we're offering to them? And then, 30 seconds into that daydream, I realized that the captioning was for me because I had stopped listening to what the speaker was saying, but I could read and get caught right back up where they were. And it's super awesome. You have to do it.
You can also not have her necessarily have to be at the event. We've had them, and I think it's been Amanda both times, for DevOps Days Chicago, where she taps into the live stream and does it remotely from whatever location she's at. And I had to laugh. I saw a tweet about Amanda, about the captioner, Amanda calling out, making a joke to the MC, and she did the exact same thing to me, which was especially funny because she wasn't there. And it's like you see there, and you see because she's literally saying everything you say, and I'm stumbling over some stupid word and just like vamping and waiting for my turn to for the event to get started, and she's dutifully captioning every ridiculous thing I'm saying on stage and trash talking as it goes, and it's pretty great. So
yeah,
I'll double down on that one.
As soon as I found out that she could do it remote, I hadn't realized that, and so of course we brought her on site. But as soon as I found out that they could do it remote, I decided at that point that I would never, ever, ever have them do it remote. It is so much cooler when they're in the room.
I'm sure.
And because this was a DevOps Days, one of my favorite moments of it was during the open spaces. She had reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'd love to propose an open space, but I'm going to be typing while the open spaces are being proposed." I said, "Don't worry, I'll propose one for you." So I got to stand up and say words as if I was Amanda, and she typed them. It was super awesome.
Yeah, so White Coat does GopherCon too. Our captioner is Stacy Potenza, and could not love them more.
Yeah.
And so, they specialize in doing tech conferences. That's usually people's concern. So they are really good about hearing things like SQL and typing SQL. Yeah. And they are amazing.
Yeah, and so Amanda ran an open space where she showed off the technology. She let us play. She brought two of her stenographer machines, like the little keyboards. So we got to play with those. It's just super fun. My second pick, I've been doing some more screencasting lately because I like to either have demos in my talks that are pre-recorded so that I can play or piano on the keyboard, because nobody cares how many typos I make, but they can see the things happening live. But they're also good for like webinars and so forth. But the screencast tool that I use is called ScreenFlow, and it works on the Mac, and it's amazing. And if you want to capture anything that happens on your screen, do it with ScreenFlow. So those are my 2 checkouts. Thanks.
I think next we have Nell.
Hey, so first I want to echo Nathan's pick of Amanda from White Coat Captioning. I was speaking at Uptime Conference in Pittsburgh last year. I believe PJ was there as well.
I was there as well, yeah.
And Brian Cantrell, who's the CTO of Joyent, did a talk. And if you've ever seen a Brian Cantrell talk, you know he speaks like he's had 4 cups of coffee and then has been fast forwarded. And I could practically see smoke coming up from Amanda's fingers as she captioned him, and it was just remarkable to see. So echoing that one, my second pick is the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 audio interface. Why would you want an audio interface? Audio interface takes the analog signal from your mic, translates it into a digital one for your computer. It picks up a lot of subtlety in your voice, and for me, it's generally a better quality recording. I mean, I could call the 2i2 a beginner audio interface, but I'd say it's served me well for 5 years. I wouldn't call myself a beginner podcaster anymore, so highly recommend that one. My other pick is a more generic one, and that is Ice Packs. It's in the high 80s in Seattle right now, and before you groan, because I know it's hotter in other areas of the country. Most Seattle apartments and buildings do not have air conditioning, so we really suffer when the temperature gets above 80. So I got this technique from my pet rabbits because I would wrap up an ice pack in a pillowcase and leave it down for them to snuggle. I started taking one with me to bed, and I sleep a lot better because I'm actually able to cool down enough to get to sleep. So ice packs are an ancient invention, but still worth it every time. And that's all I got.
That's amazing. I love that now. So I'm up next on the list, and this might be a self-indulgent thing to do, but I'm doing it because these are the 2 things that I've been focusing on lately, and the only 2 things that are front of mind for me. So first of all, I'm in the process of finishing up a book on developer relations called The Business Value of Developer Relations, and you can pre-order it now. And the second thing is Paul and I actually are in the midst of putting on a conference called Redeploy. That's all
I don't know
about
what you're talking about.
No, of course not. But it's all about the idea of resilient engineering and how that impacts the organizations and the teams that are making their technology resilient. The only thing that I've had time for really in the midst of that is I needed a TV show to watch that I could watch in like 5-minute snippets during Pomodoro breaks. Which I suppose is a checkout as well. Pomodoro is a technique of like getting work done by segmenting time. And the 2nd season of Queer Eye just came out on Netflix, and it's been amazing and perfect for that because it's a great like, cool, let me watch the next scene and then take another break and go back to more edits. So yeah.
Okay, so just like on our podcast, I'll follow Mary because that's, why change the format to run someone else's podcast?
Why not?
So also with the self-indulgent stuff, so I'm throwing a conference called Code Days in Buffalo, New York, September 14th and 15th. It's about DevOps, it's about development, it's about design, it's about data, it's about everything. And it's really the most important thing that you can do because mostly it's about humans. So check it out. It's at codedays.me. There's a whole long story behind that, but we don't have that kind of time. And I know this was my checkout on our podcast, but I see that Paul has his checkout from when he was on our podcast too. So I totally think this is cool. I'm a big fan of music, and I'm a big fan of emo music because I'm old. And when I say emo, I don't mean like Hot Topic and My Chemical Romance. I mean like emo when it was still good. But one of the kind of later emo bands, the Get Up Kids, got back together and put together a 4-song EP, and it's really, really good. I'm a huge fan, particularly of the single I'm Sorry, with just amazing, fun, upbeat, but emo music. The album's called Kicker, and you should check it out on Bandcamp or buy it because that's cool too. Also, one thing I think we didn't talk about too much, but setting goals. So like, with your podcast, you should set goals. With your life, you should set goals. So, 2 goals that I have, just for an example, is I would like to, at some point in time, write a talk for a conference that is then performed in the style of Hamilton. That's goal number one. Goal number two, I'd like to have a solo album out by the end of the year. So those are things that have nothing to do with my job, but I'm going to try to make them happen. Lastly, social media. There's this great social media tool out. It allows you to send messages out to people and they could read them or not read them. It's called Twitter. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but it's like really kind of cool, and you could find out what people actually care about. It's kind of like Facebook, but with less pictures and shit. So Twitter, I think it's twitter.com. You should definitely look into that. I'm a big fan. That's all I got.
Yes. So I have been crying my way through season 2, ugly crying my way through season 2 of Queer Eye. So if you like season 1, go watch season 2. Also, I've been watching Nailed It on Netflix, which is this baking show where they have amateur bakers and they make them cook or bake professionally baked cakes and cookies and stuff, but they only give them the amount of time that they would give a professional baker to do it. And so quite obviously hilarity ensues. So if you want a good little half-hour little juicy nugget of people just baking things that are funny, check out Nailed It on Netflix. Humorously, that I was complaining that there better be a season 2, and there is a season 2, so that's coming. The other thing that I thought I would mention, and I just actually subscribed, I found out about this about a month ago, the Sucker Pinch YouTube channel. It's this guy who went to, I think he has a PhD from CMU, and what brought me to his channel on YouTube was he reverse engineered the Nintendo Entertainment System to play Super Nintendo games, all based like in the cartridge. So he used like a Raspberry Pi and put it in the cartridge, and then you would put the Super Nintendo game in the original Nintendo cartridge, and it works. Like, it actually works. So he has, if you like that kind of weird technology hack stuff, the videos are a good like 25 minutes, 40 minutes, somewhere in there. So he really goes into the detail of how he does that. The other one that I watched that I actually really liked is he wanted to create a computer language that was only could use the instructions in the x86 instruction set that were printable. So the entire program could be printed like in a book. So he goes through this whole, like, since there's only 26 characters, like there's certain instructions that you can't get to. So he goes through like, okay, here's a big table of how you can basically replicate all of the instructions you would need to have a program by just doing printable characters. And then he makes a compiler for it, and he shows you how to do that. That one's pretty involved, but it's fascinating if you like cool hacks like that. So check his YouTube channel out if that kind of stuff you find interesting, and want something to watch while you're folding laundry, which is what I did.
All right, Trevor, bring us home.
All right. So, because we're talking about YouTube channels and Netflix, right? So this one I've been watching is Kiwami Japan. They make knives out of random materials. So the most recent one I saw, I think it's he made a knife out of cardboard. He's also made knives out of chocolate, like out of cheese, like all kinds of random things, and he makes super sharp knives out of it and then ranks them all against each other. It's interesting, especially if you watch it at 2 times speed. Then one I just found out about today actually is Omdu, which takes classic Doom and converts it into stereogram video. And if you're not familiar with what stereograms are, they're those pictures that look like static that used to be on people's office walls. And when you stare at them, they eventually go 3D when your eyes cross just right. Somebody made that into, yes, Magic Guy. Somebody turned Doom into that. So you can actually play Doom in that. It's weird and kind of hurts your face a little bit, but it's fun.
This explains a lot, Trevor.
And then you mentioned Nailed It, Paul. You reminded me of the series Pastry Chef Attempts to Make Blank from Bon Appetit. The one I linked is the Pastry Chef Attempts to Make Skittles. And it's super interesting because she tries to make gourmet like versions of classic candies and confectionery things, and really it winds up just being her getting frustrated about how hard it is to do those particular things because they're typically done at a factory by machines. And it's funny.
My favorite episode of Nailed It is the Japanese episode, because they try to have him make sushi, like cake sushi, and it turns out as you would imagine.
There's one that features a Trump omelet. Well, an unintentional Trump omelet. So watch the last episode of the first season for that.
Fantastic. Well, community and event stuff. This is usually where we would say where everybody is going to be in the upcoming fortnight, but ain't nobody got time for that. So we'll just point you towards, if you want to go speak at a DevOps Days, go to devopsdays.org/speaking. And there's a whole bunch of events that have open CFPs. Does anybody know about any other specific CFPs? I think Redeploy, y'all are closed now, right?
We are.
I thought so.
Yes.
There's a really good Go conference called GopherCon. I think everybody should go to that.
Wait,
no,
is Mark,
it's the same time as DevOps Days Chicago.
You think they should go to it?
Oh.
Zing!
Never heard the Go puns before. That's so creative.
Just
I'll
like
show
Nathan
myself
and the cooking joke.
I
That's where we
went
just
there.
evolved. Oh God.
I went there. Oh, I'll shut up now.
I can think of two, KubeCon, Shanghai, and Seattle. Their CFPs are open.
I know DevRelCon London is open right now as well, if there's DevRel folks who are listening. I think it's
Also,
open at the end of July.
In general, if you just want to find open stuff, papercall.io is a great location to go and find conferences that are open. That you can also filter by conferences that pay for travel.
I didn't see they had that.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think all the Go folks should know that, because that was built by Mark Bates, who is the guy behind Buffalo, which is big in the Go community.
It was built in Rails. We won't hold that against him, though.
Yeah.
Hey, we all started somewhere. Some of us,
I was a Rails person first. So was Brian.
Yeah, so was I. So our best Go time trivia is that the craziest episode we ever did was with Mark Bates in a Dunkin' Donuts.
Yes, I remember
really
that one.
A guy from Boston at Dunkin' Donuts? No crap.
Yeah, it was insanity.
Yeah, I think
don't have Mark on your show.
Power went out, or his internet got cut, and he got in a car and drove down to Dunkin' Donuts. Really?
Didn't he start pretending like Casey Affleck was coming up to him or something?
Oh yeah,
he did. Yeah. Mark had too much caffeine.
He's speaking at Code Days on Buffalo, and the only reason he wants to do it is because the conference is in Buffalo, New York.
Oh, nice.
So
please tell me he's going to do the whole Buffalo.
Oh, absolutely.
Buffalo thing. Okay.
7 buffaloes, yes.
Good.
The 7 buffaloes shtick, because I've never heard it before.
Of course not.
I grew up near Buffalo.
We should talk more.
There's a cold open.
I grew up near Buffalo too, like right in it.
So yeah, I was born in Warsaw, and I grew up closer to Rochester. But
I know exactly where you're from. Right on.
The first film festival I ever had a movie in was in Rochester.
See,
So
I'm
feel like
from
part of this.
The Newburgh area.
See,
Joe, please cut all this out.
Everyone's
I'm
from
Western
California.
I'm from Brazil, you guys.
I've been to Brazil. And Brazil is basically directly below Buffalo, just kind of far.
Military kid, I'm from everywhere and nowhere.
There you go.
That's right, Nell.
Nell is the one person you can meet at a conference has been like, oh, you've been there? Yeah, super unimpressed.
Yeah. Represent.
I like
you can find the show notes for this episode at arrestdevops.com/behindthemusic. Website has a link to our newsletter that we sometimes send. You can find our past episodes there, all kinds of Arrest DevOps stuff, as long as it's those 2 things, because that's pretty much all that we got. If you go to arrestdevops.com/iTunes and leave us a review in the iTunes store, theoretically that helps other people find the podcast better. We might even read your review on the air sometime, maybe. So thanks to Eric, Carlicia, Brian, Paul, PJ, Mary, Nathan, and Nell for joining Trevor and I today. This has definitely been our largest show ever, and thank you for Google Hangouts for not completely dying on us. So it's
Impressive.
Mission accomplished.
Partially die?
probably. I'm sure there's something that went terribly wrong that we just both found out about later. But so anyway, I'm Maddie. I'm at Matt Stratton.
I'm Trevor at Trevor G. Hess. This is Arrested DevOps. And remember,
There's always DevOps.
In the banana stand. Signing off.
And keep it hot.
And keep it hot.
Keep it hot. I'm just wondering, since this is named Behind the Music, like, can you get that guy and break this up into little vignettes where, like, at some point in time, like, the depressing music comes in and it's like, and that's when Nell's heroin addiction overtook the team. Like, have you never watched Behind the Music?
Oh, yeah.